What's up, internet? In this video, I'm going to talk about my favorite controllers for fighting games. Now keep in mind that these are the controllers that I personally use my own money to buy and have tested extensively. And of course there are other controllers out there that I don't have or haven't tested yet. If you play a lot of 2D fighters like Street Fighters, or any fighters that uses a 6-button layout, this is a controller you need to get. This is the Hori Fighting Commander, not the new one, but the last gen one. And be sure to get the Xbox version of this guy. The reason is, you have the assign button here, so you can map the buttons anywhere you want, and that's huge. The PlayStation version of the same controller does not allow you to do that. It's got some preset settings that you can change, but you cannot customize it any way you want. As for the controller itself, the D-pad is good. It's not great, but it's not terrible either. It's a little bit on the mushy side and it's a little bit on the bigger side, so if you have small fingers or small hands, this may not be comfortable for you. But if you have big hands and big fingers, you're going to be just fine with this guy. The D-pad is responsive. You can do diagonals and circular motions relatively easy. I don't have any problem with this D-pad. The face buttons on this guy are huge. They're really big compared to a regular controller. Look, check this out. Regular button. Look how big these guys are in comparison. See that? So that's gonna take some getting used to. Also, if you're used to a 4-button layout, you're gonna need some time getting used to the 6-button layout, because the main 4 buttons here are not lined up like a diamond. You see A is slightly to the left of Y. You see that? And B is slightly below X. So if you're used to going down and cross, you're gonna have to get adjusted. I do like the fact that the triggers are just buttons, right? So there's not a lot of travel, and also the shoulder buttons too. So these work really well. However, the gap here is pretty big, so you're gonna have to shift your index finger pretty far, but you can get used to it over time. This guy's probably the most affordable options of the whole list here, but I'm not sure about nowadays because this guy's probably discontinued. If you can find it for MSRP, it's a really good deal. Just make sure you get the Xbox version. Okay, next up I have a Pro controller from Razer. This is the Razer Wolverine Ultimate. The face buttons on this controller uses mouse switches, so they're really nice and clicky, although they don't have a lot of travel though. And if you're going to use this controller, make sure you use this D-pad right here, right? This is a split D-pad. And I kind of like this design a lot actually. So you see there's not a lot of gaps here, so it makes it really easy for you to do diagonals and pressing both buttons at the same time. And because this design is a little unconventional, you see how it's shaped weirdly, you're gonna have to get used to it, but once you do, it's pretty good. The D-pad doesn't use the same mouse clicks, but it's still pretty nice and clicky and very tactile to use. And on the top here, this is where the magic happens. Look at all of these buttons. So you have a lot of options obviously. The triggers and the shoulder buttons are just like the ones on the Xbox, but you do have these extra 2 buttons for you to do whatever. This controller does have trigger locks. The one thing I don't like are these back buttons here. They're really awkward to use and right down the middle. So you're gonna have to reach pretty far to hit them from the back. Overall, a very solid controller for any genre of games actually, but fighting games as well. Coming up, I have the 8-bit Do, or is it 8-bit Do? I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but it's the 8-bit Do Pro 2. If you're gonna get this controller, make sure you get a D-pad that looks like this, and not like this. Problem with this guy is too sticky because of these grips right here. So you can't really slide your finger back and forth really easily. On this guy, you don't have that problem. It's still a little rough, but it's nowhere near as bad. If you're someone who's used a Super Nintendo D-pad before, this feels exactly the same as that, which means it's very good. The face buttons are fantastic on these. They're very tactile and clicky. The triggers and the shoulder buttons work really well. There's no trigger locks though, unfortunately. And you do get back pedals as well. So for a controller at this price, to get back pedals, that's awesome. One killer feature for this controller, it's the fact that it's got macros, right? So you can actually program this controller to do really difficult combos or moves. I feel like it's a little cheating, but it's there. This feels to me like an evolved classic controller, right? A classic controller that's brought to the modern day. Right, it's got all the features and then some, but it look and feel really nice and classy. If you prefer PlayStation controllers, there's no better controller for fighting games than the DualShock 4. This controller is fantastic. The D-pad's very accurate, it's got good travel, and you can do all the moves on here. The face buttons are really nice and tactile and nicely spaced out. Triggers and shoulder buttons work well. Overall, a very solid controller for fighting games. Alright, at number 2, I have the SCUF Instinct Pro controller. This guy is one of my favorites ever. By glancing at it, you wouldn't know that this is a SCUF controller. You would think that this is the official Xbox Series controller. They shape it to look and feel exactly like that controller. But you get pro features with this guy. So if you turn it around, here it is. Back pedals and buttons, right? And you get trigger locks. And the triggers and the buttons feel really nice. The face buttons are clicky and tactile. And the D-pad is also very good. However, if you're going to get this controller, make sure you get the cross D-pad. Do not get the hybrid one. And I'll show you what I mean. This hybrid D-pad, when you press forward, it rolls up. You see that? And same thing when you press up. So it doesn't stay in place. But this guy does, the cross-shaped one. And I really like the spacing of the buttons here. You get just enough room so that you don't accidentally press the other buttons. And they're close enough where you can press both to do diagonals. As a whole, this controller is very good. You cannot go wrong with this controller as long as you get this cross D-pad. And on top of the list, my favorite controller for fighting games is the Xbox Series controller. And when it comes to fighting game controllers, what's the most important thing that you gotta have? You have to have a good D-pad, right? And by far, this is my favorite D-pad of any controllers. Microsoft really have outdone themselves with this D-pad. It's got a really satisfying click, but it's just soft enough where you can do it really quickly. The directionals are super accurate. It's really easy for you to do diagonals because of the raised edges here. Also because it's kind of caved in, it's really easy for you to do circular motions. Your thumb just stays in place, right? It doesn't slide around. A very nice job. This is as close to a perfect D-pad as I've tested yet on any controller. The face buttons are also clicky and tactile. And the reason why the buttons and the D-pad are so tactile and clicky is because Microsoft uses metal dome switches instead of rubber dome switches. The buttons just spring up really quickly. And you can really feel the difference when you use this controller versus any other controller that uses dome-based switches. The triggers work well, shoulder buttons work well. And another thing that makes this controller really good for fighting games is the distance between the trigger and the shoulder buttons are very close together. So you can go from the trigger to the shoulder button really quickly. Just use this part of your index finger to hit the shoulder buttons. Here you go. So trigger, shoulder button. Bam, you can go back and forth between the two really quickly. And lastly, this controller is just really comfortable to use over a long period of time. And I'll show you why. You see how the angle of my wrist is perfectly straight. Right? There's no bend whatsoever. So you can use this controller for a long time without hurting your wrist. So yes, this is my favorite controller to use for fighting games so far. The button just feels so good when you press them. It's really tactile and clicky. I just love that feeling. It's ergonomic and it just works really well. When I'm fighting top competition, this is the controller that I turn to. And I'm telling you, once you get used to this D-pad, you wish all of the D-pads are like this. And some of you may wonder, well, that's strange. The SCUF controller is just like the Xbox controller, but it's got pro features, so why isn't this number one? I'll tell you what, this guy just feels better. The button switches just feel better. The button switches on here are heavier and a little harder to push than this guy. This guy is a little more responsive. And also the SCUF controller is a lot heavier than the regular Xbox controller. This one is a lot more comfortable to use for long periods of time. Alright, that's it. I'm signing out. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and found it to be helpful. If you did, give the video a like, subscribe for more, and take care now.